Luke 15. Compassion and mercy as a wide, inclusive heart, as accepting difference and ambiguity. And then it's also echoed in Matthew 13, 24 to 30. Last week we did Luke 15. And I gave you the parable of the Good Samaritan, the prodigal son, prodigal father, the woman with the coins, the sheep. So I'm going to do the Matthew text tonight. Compassion is dealing with ambiguity. Okay? That is the famous text in Scripture of the wheat and the darnel. So Jesus says, I want to tell you a parable. There was a farmer, and he sowed wheat in his field. And while he was asleep, his enemy came and sowed darnel. And the wheat and darnel came up together, and his servants came and said, your field is full of darnel. Should we go out and pull it up? And the master said, no, because you're also going to pull up a lot of the wheat. You have to wait till they both are ripe. And in the harvest, we'll separate the wheat from the darnel. Okay. The wheat we'll put into bins, the darnel will be burned. Now, you got to be a farmer to understand that. I grew up on a farm. Wheat and darnel, they look exactly the same until they're ripe. See, so if you go and you want to weed a garden, you can tell the difference between a cabbage plant and a weed, between a carrot plant and a weed. You can weed your garden because the weeds look different than the vegetables. But wheat and darnel look exactly the same when they're growing. So you can't go out and pull the darnel out because you don't know what's darnel and what's wheat. Okay? And Jesus said you got to wait till they mature and then you can separate them. Now, that's a parable calling us to mercy, calling us to put up with human ambiguity. See, so that who's good and who's bad. You know, a lot of times you don't know. This looks, Jesus, you got to live with a lot of unresolved tension, until it's ready to be sorted out. Too often, we divide the world too quickly into good guys and bad guys. These are evil, these are good, so on, Jesus said, be careful, be very slow to judge. And at times he says, don't judge. Don't judge and you won't be judged. See, so this is this is a statement against the overcritical mindset. Great people live with great ambiguity. When we're not great, we need clarity all the time. Life is black and white. Good, bad. So black, white. Jesus says, no, most of that is shades of gray. Put up with each other. We need to learn to live with ambiguity. One of the great philosophers I ever studied under was Tom Francoeur, French-Canadian. And Tom used to say this in class. Try this line on for size. Tom would always say, that's ambiguous enough. I can live with that. See, most people say, that's clear. I want some clarity. Tom would say, that's ambiguous enough. I can deal with that. The lines are not that hardly drawn. It's right, it's wrong. This guy's in, you're out. Jesus says, no. At the end, the judge is going to decide who's in and who's out. And in the meantime, good can look like bad, and bad can look like good, and we got to live with that ambiguity. Mercy means patience. Mercy means not judging too quickly. Sometimes mercy means not judging at all. Living and letting live, and see where it goes. And remember, Jesus said the ultimate way to discern is how? He said, by your fruits you'll know them. But the fruit is when the plant is ripe. He doesn't say in its infant stage you can tell the weeds from the wheat. He said, in their maturity you can. By their fruits you'll know them. In the meantime, it calls us to live with great patience, with frustration, with ambiguity, and, patience with each other. It's mercy. Okay, the next one. So that was mercy is a wide, inclusive heart, accepting ambiguity. Now, compassion and mercy are not being the money changer who blocks access to the temple. Notice that's the second story we have from John chapter 2. I was talking before about John's gospel. John's gospel is really different than the other gospels. See, in the other gospels, they're like a chronology. You have the Annunciation, then Jesus is born, then you have the infant Jesus, and you have Jesus as a 12-year-old, and then his public life and so on. John just eliminates all of that. See, so John says, the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh. And halfway through chapter 1, Jesus is adult. He's baptizing people. He's out there. Okay, so there's no infant Jesus, 12-year-old Jesus. John just gets them. So by chapter 2, all the important things are already happening. Okay, and in chapter 2, Jesus is replacing something old and a cherished religious tradition with something new. And that's also what you have to understand this text. This is a vastly understood and misunderstood text in Scripture, and that's the cleansing of the temple, where Jesus chases the money changers out with the whips and cords and upsets their tables and so on. Well, it's interesting. In the other Gospels, he does it at the end of the Gospel. And in fact, in the other Gospels, this is what seals his fate. They want to kill him, but they're still holding off until he does this. And then he seals his fate. But in John's Gospel, this is right at the beginning. So he cleanses the temple as almost the second act that he does. Now, what is the meaning of that text? Where I said it's often misunderstood because people always say that's where you see violence in God. Remember last week I said there is no violence in God. Okay? And here they're saying, well, Jesus kicked over the tables and all that. And okay, give me some background to this text. Who were the money changers? Okay? Well, the money changers had a very important place in the temple and in the commerce of the time. See, the money changers, they weren't selling statues and holy water and pamphlets and stuff, And in fact, if you go, I love the new cathedral in Los Angeles. There's a Starbucks right in the church. I like that. People will hang around after Mass for a while, That's not what Jesus is against, okay? See, the money changers are very important, had a very important role. The temple was an international place where Jews came from all over the world, and they had to offer sacrifice, but they couldn't bring the sacrifice if they're coming from Turkey or Greece or Syria and so on. They would bring their own currency. So they would bring Greek drachma, they'd bring, Syrian currency and so on, and they had to exchange it to buy. For instance, if you go to a foreign country, actually it often doesn't work with Americans because most people take American dollars, but every other place in the world will understand this. If you go to another country, you have to exchange your currency into their currency, So if you go to Europe, you got to change dollars into euros, and then you buy with euros. See, so the money changers were like our banks. And they had a very important function. So people would come to the temple from all over the world, and they would bring their money. They would change it into to Jewish drachma and or shekels and so on. And then they would buy the animals to sacrifice in the temple, and they'd buy their lunch and from vendors and so on. Now, these money changers, probably like all money changers, took a little cut. No, that's not what he was upset about. He didn't say, you're dishonest and so on. He says, you have turned my father's house into a market square. But he wasn't talking about you build a Starbucks here. You're going to see what he means by the market square. What he's doing is this. He's saying, this is the principle, and I'll tease it out for you. He's saying, from now on, remember, in John's Gospel, he's replacing the old with the new. He said, in former days, to be a pious Jew, you have to change your other currency into Jewish currency to wash in this temple. He says, you don't have to anymore. Now all currencies work. And he kicks over the money tables. Notice he doesn't kill anybody, doesn't hurt anybody. He just kicks over the money tables and so on. And he drives them out symbolically from the temple. Why? He's teaching this point. Let me give it with a different story. Just a chapter later in John's Gospel, he's going to meet the Samaritan woman at the well. And in John's Gospel, she's going to become the first believer in John's Gospel, the first person who converts. So he's having this conversation with the Samaritan woman. It's very interesting. And at one point, the Samaritan woman says to him, I'm a Samaritan, and the Jews said you have to worship in the temple in Jerusalem, and the Samaritans say you have to worship up on Mount Gerizim, so where do I have to worship? And Jesus says you don't have to worship on any of those places. The temple's in the heart. See, after Jesus, you can worship anywhere. It doesn't have to be Rome, Salt Lake City, Mecca, Jerusalem, wherever. Someplace. Jesus says the temple is everywhere. See, you don't have to turn your currency into an... This is actually a very, very radical text, and it upset all the temple commerce. It's like somebody said, you don't have to be a Roman Catholic to be saved. Well, you'd be suspended pretty quickly if you're a Catholic, Jesus is in effect saying that. He's saying you don't have to go through anybody to get to God. See, and the real danger, who the money changers are today? I'm one of them. Priests and parish teams say, you want your kid baptized? You're going through me, and you're going to take 6 courses or I'm not going to do it for you, and so on. See, those are money changers. They're saying, or if you don't go to church, you can't go to heaven, and so on. He's saying, no, we're money changers. Jesus would kick a lot of us out. He's saying, you don't have to go through anybody anymore. You have direct access to God through Jesus, okay? Sometimes when I say this, people say, well, then what's the value of the church? If you can go to heaven without going to church, if you can go to heaven without priests and parish councils and RCA programs and catecheses and catechisms and priests and so on, what's the value? Well, you know what the church is? The church is a very valuable GPS. You can save yourself a half of a lifetime of fiddling around on bad roads. See, the church will say, recalculating, I think you want to do this. And so, see, the church is, you can go somewhere without a GPS. You might get lost a lot, and you might, spend 10 extra hours getting there. A GPS can be really valuable. Religions are really valuable. They figured out the roads and so on. They said, you want to get to heaven, we can direct you. Turn right, turn left, go to this confessional, turn to the other place, and so on. And then recalculating every time you screw up and so on. See, that's what the church is. But it's not, you're going through me or you don't go to heaven. See, these money changers say, you're going through us or you can't worship in the temple. See, that's the real. So Jesus is saying, we have to be merciful enough to, as church, to realize it isn't through us. I was in New York City 3 years ago on a Sunday in May. So if I'm in New York City, I'm going to go to St. Patrick's Cathedral. It's the Cathedral of Roman Catholicism in the United States. So I went there on Sunday, and the homily was just awful. And I don't say that very often, I like most homilies, but the priest said this. The priest said, Jesus said, I'm the vine, we're the branch. You're the branches. Said, the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church is the vine. You're the branches, but if you disconnect, you can't go to heaven. He said, and the way you connect is going to Mass on Sunday. And if you don't go to Mass on Sunday, it's a mortal sin. And if you die like that, you'll go to hell. And he said, I know you don't want to hear this, so I'll say it again to repeat it, See, that's a money changer. Very sincere man. These money changers were sincere. There's one way to go there. You're going through me. You're going through this parish council. You're going through this parish. You're going through this sacramental program. And you might say, no, I don't have to. See, all currency works. Basically what this saying, this text means all currency works for God. Interesting enough, I give a little footnote to that too, and subsequent thing to it. A few years ago, and again, I like this guy, so I'm saying this gently, but when Benedict was Pope, Benedict was really hoping to restore Latin to the church, and Benedict really believed that it's the language for church, that, Catholicism, Christianity, is a language of Latin. And the theologians just absolutely clubbed him into submission. They said, it's completely wrong. Latin's a beautiful language. Don't get me wrong. I had to study Latin for 6 years and so on. And now I don't get a chance to use it anymore. It's a beautiful language. It's just one language. It's not a privileged language. And why do I say this? Because Christianity is a language of translation. Christianity, in general, is a language of translation. And you see that at Pentecost. Pentecost happens, and they come out of the Pentecost room, and then Luke, who writes this up, Luke says, everybody heard the gospel spoken in their own language. The people didn't say, wow, I can understand Greek. I understand Latin. They said, no, I understand the gospel in my own language. See, there is no privileged language in Christianity. There is in, for instance, the Muslims, there's a privileged language. The Quran has to be read in this language, and so on. In Christianity, or even in Judaism, a bit of a language, that Hebrew is privileged. In Christianity, we've tried to privilege Latin, and it's not to be privileged. Christianity is, the Holy Spirit speaks all the languages, and all the languages are equal. And see, here Jesus says, all currency works to get to God. So he's taking away anybody who says, you got to go through me, you got to go through this. Jesus says, no, you don't. You're a money changer. Okay. It's interesting. There's other subtler things in that. Remember in the Synoptic Gospels, there's an incident where Jesus is preaching in a house, and they're trying to get a sick person to him, and they can't. And so they have to go up on the roof, and they take some boards off the roof and then lower the sick person. That must have been quite a scene. Jesus said, oh, they're ferrying this guy down, and so on. See, but the same thing. The people around Jesus are blocking somebody from getting to him. We got to be real careful. We're the people around Jesus that we aren't blocking access. As a theologian, I worry about that. Everything I say, am I blocking access to Jesus? Am I blocking access to God? See, the money changers, they were blocking access to God. They're saying, you got to go through me, and they got a little profit angle to it. I wish they will never invite me, but I wish I could speak to parish councils and people who run parish programs and say, be careful how programmatic you are. Say, you don't go to this program, we're not going to baptize your kid. They have a right to baptism. You don't have a right to stop them. You can invite them to take courses, but they have a right to the sacraments. And so we got to be real careful. This is a strong text. An incident, it did Jesus in. That's in the Synoptic Gospels that at the end, and that's the straw that breaks the camel's back. When Jesus chases them out, so much was around temple commerce. He upset the whole economic system by doing that, but it also upset the religious people really, really badly, to say, what if they don't have to go through us? Then Caiaphas says, I think it's better we kill one person for the people. And that one person was Jesus. This is pretty strong doctrine, but I'm not making this stuff up. Okay. So compassion is not being a money changer. You have to be always cautious. I'm not blocking access to Christ. Now, compassion is taking off our outer garments so as to wash each other's feet. Now notice I'm leaning a lot on Joe 9 texts here. John's gospel was written much later and is much more of a mystical gospel. Notice he hasn't got that strong narrative you have in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So there's John, he's making mystical points. And this is, and his gospel was also written very late. Okay? So that they estimate that John's gospel was written somewhere between the year 90 and 100. Now, why is that important? Well, if Jesus died in 33, so we estimate Jesus died the year 33, John is writing his gospel some 70 years after Jesus' death. And he himself would have been a very old man. He must have been in his 90s. Okay? He's the last living apostle. All the other apostles have been martyred by this time. John alone is alive. He's got to be in his 90s. And he writes this gospel, but he's seen 70 years of church life. And 70 years of church life then is like 70 years of church life now. Which means they fought about everything. So by the time John writes this gospel, they're already, for instance, about the Eucharist. There are already about 4 different theologies of the Eucharist. Someone says, what's the theology of the Eucharist in the New Testament? Well, no, you make it plural. There are theologies of the Eucharist in the New Testament. By the time John died, they already were doing this. Some communities, like John's community, were celebrating Eucharist every day. Incidentally, that's where we get the Roman Catholic thing of daily Eucharist. And Christians who do Eucharist every day, that's Joe 9. Some of the other communities were celebrating it only on Sunday. Some were celebrating it only a few times a year, and so on. And they were arguing who can preside, and about rubrics and so on, the way we are today. And they had different names for it. Some were calling it the Lord's Supper. Some were calling it communion, and so on, much the same as today. So John is looking at all of this. Now, it's very interesting. John has a Last Supper scene. In the other Gospels, the Last Supper is one paragraph. The night before he died, Jesus took bread, took wine, said, my body is my blood. In John's Gospel, the Last Supper is over half of the Gospel. Over half of the Gospel is a long speech that Jesus gives at the Last Supper. It's over half of John's Gospel. Okay, and it's all of Jesus' teaching. It kind of has his fundamental teaching at the Last Supper. And very interesting, in John's Gospel, he doesn't mention the bread and wine at the Last Supper. So in the other three Gospels said, at the Last Supper, Jesus took bread, took wine, says, my body is my blood, do this in remembrance of me. John's Gospel, half the Gospel is the Last Supper, doesn't mention the bread and wine. And where the other Gospels have the bread and wine, he has the basin and the towel. So that they said, see, the other Gospels, at the supper, Jesus took bread, says, this is my body, took wine, this is my blood. John's Gospel said, at the Last Supper, Jesus got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and began to wash the disciples' feet. So where the others have the bread and wine, John substitutes the basin and the towel. And it's very interesting, the Christian communities, Roman Catholics included and so on, notice the text we read on Holy Thursday, the gospel we read when we commemorate the institution of the Eucharist. On Holy Thursday, we commemorate the institution of the Eucharist. We get to the gospel, and don't read about bread and wine. We read about the basin and the towel. Very interesting. See, what happened to the bread and wine? Okay. No. See, John substitutes them, because in John's gospel is a different Eucharistic theology. Eucharist is already going on in chapter 6. Remember, chapter 6 said, Jesus, I'm the bread of life. And the Eucharist is the daily manna. That's the way you go. Every day you need to eat fresh. God comes to you daily. It's like they fed the Israelites in the desert with manna. God feeds us every day with his body and blood and so on. Okay. So when John gets to the Last Supper, instead of mentioning the bread and wine, not that he eliminates it, he just doesn't mention it, he substitutes the basin and the towel, and he's trying to make a very, very specific point. Now, this is actually a very deep text. And let me just quote it from by heart. And John writes this very carefully. He said, at the supper, Last Supper, Jesus, knowing that he had come from God, and that he was going back to God, and that therefore all things were possible for him, got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and began to wash the disciples' feet against their protests. Now, this has two levels of meaning. And again, we get the first level. And this is the homiletics we get, and the iconography we get, and so on. The liturgy celebrates the servanthood, where Jesus, the master, washes the servant's feet. See, that's what we celebrate very much in our theology and liturgy. See, this is an act of humility, that Jesus got up, and he's the master, but he washes the servant's feet, and that's a powerful point. Remember a great poem by John Shea, and John Shea says, at the Last Supper, Jesus got up, and he took the mantle of privilege and turned it upside down and turned it into the apron of service. Isn't that a great line? You take the mantle of privilege and turn it into the apron of service. So it's a great act of humility, but John has something else in mind. There are two kinds of acts of humility. Some are easy to do and some are hard to do. Okay? Let me give you one that's a great act, but it's still easy to do. Imagine it's Christmas Day, and you go to church in the morning, and then before you do your Christmas dinner, you go downtown or to some homeless shelter, and you help serve a meal to some homeless people. You did a wonderful thing, And you go home, and you shower, and you clean up before your dinner, and you feel good. You did something wonderful. It's an act of humility. See, you don't have to serve homeless people, but you did. Okay? But it's not that hard to do. And in fact, you actually feel pretty good doing it. Still do it. It's a different kind of humility. When you have to reach across something. Let me give you an example of that. You know what I think John would do if he came back today? If I ask you this, what's the single most morally divisive issue in our culture? Abortion. Okay? You know what John would do if he came back today? He'd say, let's not have arguing, pro-life, pro-choice. Let's bring out a basin and towel, and we'll have pro-life wash pro-choice's feet. Then we'll have pro-choice wash pro-life's feet. Then we'll have Hillary Clinton wash Donald Trump's feet. And we'll have Donald Trump wash Hillary Clinton's feet. We'll have Democrats wash Republican feet. Republicans, Democrats. Then we'll have Christian wash some Arab, Muslim feet. We'll have some Al-Qaeda people wash some Christian feet. And then maybe we have some chance for peace in our world. He said, that's what the Eucharist means. See, and that's a lot harder to do. It's one thing to feed a homeless person. It's another thing to reach across to somebody who's different than you. A little like Jesus. Can you do that for an enemy? You know? And but now, there's something deep inside the text. On what basis does he do this? Okay? You know, they said, at the supper, Jesus, knowing he had come from God and was going back to God, got up from the table and took off his outer robe. Now, that's an interesting thing. You know, when on Holy Thursday, you're a priest, you have to wash people's feet. You have to take off your chasuble, otherwise it gets in the water, you know. And so this is what's kind of a practical thing. You have to, otherwise, you know, this stuff is getting in the water, you know, but it's not the deep part of it. The outer robe is more than your outer clothing. Your outer robe and also all of your outer identities. He stripped himself down to just one identity. I've come from God, I'm going back to God. Okay? Now, you and I also have outer clothing and an inner identity. You know, what's our outer clothing? Well, I can give you mine. I'm a Roman Catholic, I'm a Caucasian, I'm a Canadian, I'm pro-life and on, and I'm an Oblate of Mary Immaculate and all. So that's all, I speak English, so on. That's all my outer robe. And when I have that on, there's certain things I can't do. Then I can't wash the feet of somebody who's pro-choice. Okay? If you take that off, if you take off your outer clothing, your religion, your gender, your nationality, and so on, and then you only have one identity left. You've come from God, and you're going back to God, and therefore all things are possible for you. You can wash the feet of anybody on this entire planet. You can wash Hitler's feet. You know? See, because you're not wearing... Then notice afterwards, he puts them back on. Then Jesus put his clothes back on. We normally need those clothes. You know, they're not bad, but John's saying there come, again, mercy. Mercy, there are times, it's like the Good Samaritan, where you take off all those clothes. Where it doesn't matter that I'm a priest. It doesn't matter I'm a Roman Catholic. It doesn't matter I'm a white, Caucasian, male, speaking English. That's my outer clothing. It's very important. But at a certain point, mercy goes below it. You simply have to take off your outer clothes and wash the feet of whoever is there. It's John's deepening of the parable of the Good Samaritan. Are you getting this, sir? Okay. And it's really a wide-reaching thing. You know, in fact, I think this is the place in the gospel, someone says, that stretches you further than any other place. Jesus says, you simply have to reach across all barriers. Slave, Gentile, male, female, Catholic, you know, Christian, Arab. You have to reach across all those barriers. Because normally we wear clothes, you know, inner clothes. But there comes a time when he says, your inner identity. The inner identity is the same for everybody in the world. You've come from God, and you're going back to God. And when we're wearing that inner identity only, then all things are possible for you. Notice how he writes that. Jesus realizing he had come from God, he was going back to God, and therefore all things were possible for him, took off his outer robe, and began to wash the disciples' feet. That's the Good Samaritan parable taken by John to new levels. It demands a lot of us.